Greetings, family. Welcome to the African Exodus show. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie, here to you with a new video. Before we get started with today's program, I want to remind you all, if you have not already, please do add yourself to my Telegram channel. Telegram is the app that I primarily use, and so you can stay in the loop as far as videos that I post that way. But with that, let's get started with African and world news. Past weekend, you might have been glued to your TV screens watching some conflict going on inside of the country of Russia as far as this Wagner group. And if you did not know, there was supposedly what some people are labeling a coup of sorts. Mutiny is what Putin called it. Basically a rebellion inside of armed forces inside of Russia, with the Wagner group being front and centered and being the one who was actually leading this initiative. Now, since then, people are now looking at Wagner more and more, and obviously before we've talked about this group as far as their role in Africa, as far as how many African governments have been leaning on them as a means to resist former colonial powers such as France. But many people want to focus on their activities there. One particular person, Joe Biden, is going to try to use this moment as leverage in order to rock Putin and rock Russia. So let's talk about the Wagner group. Obviously a group that has a very contentious relationship with the African continent, one that the West says is exploitative or terroristic. Of course, we should know not to follow one side's label of any group, no matter which side it is. As far as Russia and Wagner side, or the Africans who are actually utilizing their services, they look at them as being a partner, as opposed to France. Operation Barkhane, whenever that operation was happening inside of these African countries, they looked at that relationship as exploitative. So let's look at the Wagner group in particular, just in case you're not familiar with who they are and what they do, and let's talk about their activities in Africa. So this article is adverse to the Wagner group, just giving you a spoiler. The Russian mercenary group that briefly threatened President Vladimir Putin's authority has for years been a ruthless force for hire across Africa, protecting rulers at the expense of the masses. Just again, this article has a negative view of Wagner, but the issue I have is when they want to highlight Wagner for these reasons, but don't highlight the fact that before Wagner came after French colonial authorities, and they will never, ever point out their role or the U.S., NATO, AFRICOM forces. They'll never label them the same. They'll never say that these militaries have been a ruthless force. Instead, they save that type of criticism for those who they want to demonize. So that's just something to keep in mind. But again, the article says the dynamic is not expected to change now that the group's founder, Prigozhin, has been exiled to Belarus as punishment for the failed coup. The Wagner group brutalizes civilians in the Central African Republic, Mali, and elsewhere to crush dissent and fend off threats to their leaders. In exchange, Russia gains access to natural resources and ports through which weapons can be shipped, and receives payments that enrich the Kremlin and help it fund operations elsewhere, including the war in Ukraine. Neither Russia nor African leaders dependent on Wagner's fighters have interest in ending those relations, they say. They go on to say, asked whether Wagner's weekend of mutiny could erode Russia's position in Africa. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told a TV network that security assistance to African countries would continue. So if you're wondering whether or not Wagner has left their posts inside of Africa after the coup weekend, according to them, they're still going to continue their mission or their operations inside of the African continent. He specifically mentioned the Central African Republic and Mali. Remember those two countries? And noted that Russian government officials have maintained contact with leaders there. In Mali, at least 1,000 Wagner fighters replaced French troops brought in to fight Islamic extremists, and the U.S. alleges that the Kremlin uses the country as a way station for arms missions to Russian forces in Ukraine. But the Malian government has denied using Wagner for any purpose other than training. In the Central African Republic, a statue in the capital, Bangui, I don't know if I pronounced that correct, but it pays tribute to Russian mercenaries who have helped keep President Faustin Archange Tudera in power. Lavrov told RT that hundreds of Russian fighters would still remain there. Something that is interesting about this article, they note, as we have talked about on this channel, the fact that Wagner is supposedly there to fight Islamic extremists. And we talked in our last African and Road News segment about where a lot of these Islamic extremists come from. They are literally inventions. They are creations of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States Armed Forces. They train these groups. They send them out. These groups were the scapegoat for many countries inside of the so-called war on terror. They were utilized in order to allow Congress to pass legislation that was going to fund armed forces, fund different wars. And so these terrorist groups are a controlled segment, and Wagner groups similarly are a controlled group by Russia. So in a way, this is a proxy war in itself when you think about it. When you think about the fact that you have these Islamic extremists who, although off the record, there's enough information on the books to say that these are creations of the CIA who are in Africa doing things in order to give leverage to a country like France, which formerly was the one supposedly fighting these Islamist extremists. Well, that's what they're there for. They're there to allow France and other colonial powers access into Africa. And instead, to the dismay of many Africans, now you have the country saying we no longer want France or we no longer want the United States to help deal with these terrorist groups. Now we want to look to Russia, which is, of course, goes contrary to the entire reason why those Islamic extremist groups were put inside of the African continent to begin with. So Biden had an interesting response. We're going to go to what Biden put forth as a result of this coup, although it's not what it says. But Biden administration slapped sanctions related to Prigozhin's Wagner group in Africa over death and destruction. This happened Tuesday, which I believe was the 27th. So this happened on Tuesday, days after the Wagner group's coup. Now, or so-called coup. Obviously, if Biden waits till now in order to put sanctions on the Wagner group for their activities in Africa, and there's no reason for them to have done this now as opposed to have done this before, there's more to the story. They're doing this either to punish Wagner for not following instructions or not following the demands of U.S. military forces as far as trying to get Putin out of power, or they're doing it to put pressure on Wagner because supposedly they've made some advancements inside of Ukraine since staging this coup. So Biden administration on Tuesday took aim at Russia's notorious mercenary organization known as Wagner Group by targeting individuals and entities with ties to the group. The mercenary group has been accused of carrying out human rights abuses in coordination with certain military entities in places like Mali and the Central African Republic. Remember, I told you to remember those two places, prompting the State Department to take action through international sanctions. Now it says death and destruction has followed in Wagner's wake in everywhere it has operated, and the United States continues to take action to hold it accountable. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said Tuesday, illicit actors such as Wagner exploit resources to gain revenue and sow conflict, corruption, and other harms throughout the region. Wagner has used its operations in Mali both to obtain revenue for the group and its owner, as well as to procure weapons and equipment to further its involvement in hostilities in Ukraine. Blinken added in listing a Russian national who has also been a target in northern sub-Saharan nations. Now, Wagner is believed to operate not only in Ukraine and Syria, but through Africa with some 10,000 troops across Angola, CAR, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Madagascar, Libya, Mali, Mozambique, Sudan, Zimbabwe, and possibly Eritrea. Just to put this out there, what do many of these countries have in common? Well, many of them, if not probably all of them, many of them have fallen outside of the graces of the Western imperialists. A lot of them are viewed as countries that are that are now enemies to the West, enemies to NATO. A lot of these countries are demonized across the media. So when you hear that, oh, they're inside of Eritrea, they're inside of Zimbabwe, they're in Sudan, they're in these countries that a lot of conflicts have been waged inside of by Western powers, that shows you that the U.S. targeting this group may have more to do with simply being upset about supposed atrocities of the Wagner group. So here's the thing that I want to emphasize. Number one, it's been spoken about certain people that Wagner, the so-called coup or whatever, was supposedly possibly something that was sponsored by the Central Intelligence Agency in itself, which would not surprise me, and that they were possibly paid billions of dollars. If you don't know, billions of dollars went missing from the U.S. Treasury that was supposed to go to Ukraine. They were paid those billions of dollars in order to do this coup against Putin. However, they didn't go forward with it. Now, that does give some credits to the fact that Joe Biden comes after the fact, after this so-called attempted coup, and now wants to put sanctions on Wagner, which again looks like punishment. So this is a key factor, I think, in what the intentions of the Biden administration were as far as this coup or coup attempt in Russia. At the same time, though, as far as Africa being now used and paraded around media, as far as the Wagner group, this obviously has nothing to do with the people on the ground. It has nothing to do with what's in the best interest of Africa. Because again, when France was inside of these countries, when France was in CAR and Mali, when they were doing their Operation Barkhane, a lot of people were dying from French forces. And in fact, the United Nations even called out the French troops for their activities inside of these countries. And yet, no word from the United States, no cries from the United States. Obviously, whenever the U.S. does atrocities over abroad, they don't care too much either. But now they care about this Wagner group because, in my opinion, they failed to complete the mission, right? So this is just something to know that, again, we're being scapegoated. Proxy wars are being waged in Africa. All of this, though, is about trying to shift the world order or keep the world order as is and prevent a shift in the world order as the Russian country, as well as China, the Chinese country, as these pose a real threat to U.S. hegemony. So that's just one thing I want you all to keep in mind, but let's go to the next story. I wanted to cover this Jonathan Majors story because I think this is something that we can learn from. Some people don't learn lessons the first time around. So we're going to talk about Jonathan Majors. Jonathan Majors claimed that he was a victim in a March assault and files a counter complaint against his ex. Marvel actor Jonathan Majors has filed a domestic violence complaint against ex-girlfriend Grace Jabari, accusing her of scratching and hitting him while she was drunk during a March argument that earned Majors assault and harassment charges. Now, I'll paint the picture for you. Big, strong black men, fragile white woman, they're together, and one person gets abused, one person gets scratched and hit. It's the black man, but who ends up in jail? The black man, not the same victim. That's what's being alleged by Jonathan Majors. 2 days after the actor's June 22nd complaint, the NYPD issued an investigation card, or an I-card, that gives cops probable cause to arrest Jabari, a 30-year-old professional dancer, for assault, and sources told the Post. Priya Chaudhary, Majors' attorney, said the NYPD search for Jabari buttresses the lawyer's long-held argument that the Creed 3 actor is the real victim of the Pierce-Stormy relationship. From the beginning, we have said Jonathan Majors is innocent and probably the victim. And last week, for the first time, Mr. Majors met with the NYPD to present them with evidence of what really happened that night. Within hours of viewing the evidence and conducting their own thorough investigation, the NYPD found probable cause to arrest Grace Jabari for assaulting Jonathan Majors. In legal filings obtained by the Post, Chaudhary said a cab driver claims Jabari attacked Majors on March 25th while she was trying to nab his phone on the way home from a bar in Brooklyn. The driver also allegedly saw a woman hitting and scratching and attacking Majors, who asked him to stop the car so he could get out. The driver's story proves Majors didn't hit or choke Jabari in any way at any time or even raised his voice. As I said, some of us don't learn lessons the first time around. I remember one of the first videos I did on this channel, it was about Nate Parker. Nate Parker, who was accused, not convicted, but he was accused of sexually assaulting a woman in college. And without any proof, without any due process, or in fact, without something actually, without even having been convicted the first time, without any proof, the court of public opinion convicted him, decided that he was guilty, and literally his career has never been the same. Now, let me be very clear. I am not someone who cares about the system, the celebrity system. I'm not someone that cares for Hollywood. I'm not someone that finds my justice through whether or not a celebrity gets justice or not. However, when our people have been conditioned by this system to participate inside of public lynchings, that's a concern. Not because we care about celebrities, but we have to care about our own mental psychology, our own self-esteem, our own understanding of white supremacy and how it seeks to make us demonize one another. Understand that originally the KKK would be the ones out there killing our people. Originally, the KKK would be the ones accusing our Black men of sexual assault and going out and lynching them. That was their role. However, somehow in today's age, we have seen a reversal. Now the KKK has stepped back. You see them come out every once in a while. They still exist. But overwhelmingly, our people are the ones who are doing the crimes. We are the ones who are hurting one another. We are the ones that are inflicting violence on one another. And now we are the ones who are participating in public lynchings, something that was a purposeful effect of this parading of feminist ideology inside of our communities. And so we see a lot of Black women that just jumped on majors, like they weren't just marching for other Black men, like they weren't talking about other Black men who have been accused, like they don't talk about people like George Stinney or people like Emmett Till, falsely accused Black men. We've seen a lot of women jump in and basically take this white woman's her word for it over any evidence. And so this is what I wanted to talk about, is the fact that we have this conflicting narrative that there's this rape culture in America where women aren't believed, where women aren't protected, or where the culture basically allows for the rape of women. But we don't want to talk about the longer held rape culture in America, the one that has always been most relevant to our people. That is the rape culture that says that if a Black man is accused of hurting a white woman, if a Black man is accused of doing harm to a white woman, that must be true. And so far, so many of our people have joined in the very people who have been parading this ideology around for a long time amongst themselves. But some of our people want to go and participate with that same system and see that our own people are publicly lynched. That's a problem, no matter who it is. I don't agree with everything Jonathan Majors does. I don't agree with what he stands for. I don't agree with what Hollywood stands for. But I've become very concerned whenever we want to join in on demonizing ourselves, because how are you doing that in your personal life? Are you also looking at your brothers and your sisters that you see on a day-to-day basis and you're criminalizing them in your mind? So that's what I wanted to talk about. Please learn from Nate Parker's situation. All evidence proves that that man did not rape anyone, yet he still lost his entire career. And here we are again. All evidence was not even out yet. And yet our own people, women and men, but mostly women, jumped out there to demonize a man without having even done anything that they could actually prove. So that's a sad thing, but hopefully we can learn to love ourselves and love one another, Black men and Black women, and stop falling for these charades. Let's go to the next story. Reparations are something that are obviously spoken about widely within the African community because our people have been so oppressed and so sought after and so exploited. And I think this is an interesting story because here we are, a country that actually won the right to reparations in the court of law, and yet their oppressor is trying to act like they never heard of such things. And of course, this is the United States with Nicaragua. So let's talk about this. The U.S. owes Nicaragua reparations, must implement a 1986 International Court of Justice ruling. Now, when you hear about, is Russia going to arrest Putin, or is South Africa going to arrest Putin for the ICC? Are they going to do what they're supposed to do as far as being a member of the ICC? The United States was actually found guilty of an International Criminal Court ruling, and yet has been skipping those charges, won't pay up, won't owe up, and are playing the victim in this situation. International Court of Justice in Hague ruled in 1986 that the U.S. government violated international law in its attacks on Nicaragua, that it owed the Central American nation reparations. June 27, 2023 was the 37th anniversary of this ruling, and Washington still to this day refuses to pay the Nicaraguans money that is legally owed to it. Keep in mind, I have to remind everyone, who has the United States paid reparations to that they've actually done nothing to? They've paid reparations to Jewish communities, even though they never participated in the Holocaust. They're paying, or you taxpayers in America, you're paying for the Holocaust that you never had anything to do with. And yet, as actual country that won in the court of justice the rights to reparations, they're dodging them. They're pretending as though it never happened. And we'll talk about why in a moment. In 1986, the top UN court determined that the U.S. repeatedly violated international law by training, arming, equipping, financing, and supplying the Contra paramilitaries in Nicaragua, attacking Nicaraguan infrastructure, putting mines in Nicaraguan ports, imposing an embargo on Nicaragua, and encouraging the Contras to commit atrocities that violate international and humanitarian law. Yes, the country did all that. Nicaragua's current government has publicly called on the United States to meet its obligations under international law. This June 26, Nicaragua's President Daniel Ortega sent a letter to the UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez demanding that Washington pay reparations. There exists a historical debt with the Nicaraguan people that 37 years later has not been settled by the United States, Ortega said. And it is an obligation clearly established in a final judgment of the highest international authority, the International Court of Justice. The U.S. war on terror on Nicaragua Sandistas. In case you don't know, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Iran-Contra scandal. Many of you have heard of the trafficking of cocaine into Black communities. Many of you might not know why that was done. All of this was done as a way to fund this terrorist organization known as the Contras, and that was all a way for the United States government to try to change or do regime changes out of Nicaragua. So this is important context because, as we spoke about last week, many of these terrorist groups, if not all of these terrorist groups, were creations of deep state entities. In this case, the CIA, which we know created, as we said earlier, Al-Qaeda, has created ISIS. Well, they also created this terrorist group inside of Nicaragua. Following the triumph of Nicaragua's socialist Sandinista revolution in 1979, the United States created a far-right terror army that sought to violently overthrow the new revolutionary government. The CIA and trained death squads known as the Contras, short for counter-revolutionaries. With U.S. backing, the Contras systematically used terrorism to destabilize Nicaraguan society. A former Contra leader, one of the country's most powerful oligarch families, Edward Chamorro, published an open letter in the New York Times in 1986 admitting that terror is the most effective weapon of the Contras. It was premeditated policy to terrorize civilian non-combatants and to prevent them from cooperating with the government. Hundreds of civilian murders, mutilations, tortures, and rapes were committed in pursuit of this policy, he recalled. Referring to the Contras as CIA puppets and a proxy army controlled by the United States government, Chamorro wrote that the Contras burned down schools, homes, and health centers as fast as the Sandistas built them. In 1984, the Nicaraguan government filed a case with the United Nations judicial organ, the International Court of Justice, demanding legal action against the United States for its attacks. The government refused to represent itself in court. U.S. government refused to represent itself in court, boycotting the case. In order to do so, Washington refused to accept the legitimacy of the UN-backed ICJ, determining so-called rules-based order international. It undermined the rules-based international order that the United States claims it supports. ooh, the craziness of it all. So, of course, the U.S. is not trying to pay reparations for any regime change. They're not trying to pay reparations for any coups, any assassinations. They're not trying to pay reparations for any of the crimes that they continue to do or any of the crimes that they did in the past, because they understand once one country actually gets payment for reparations, then it becomes unleashed on the entire world, because more than any other country in the history of the world, the United States has literally imposed their will and foreign policy on people who had no control over their own natural destinies. And so this is something that's not surprising that they're dodging this court ruling. To me, it's more appalling that this was actually something that was decided in court and so many people ignore it. So many people continue to believe the presidents and the national security chairs and all these people who are so important. They continue to believe their word even after like so-called weapons of mass destruction. These same people who will look in the past and say, maybe we should not have believed these people or believe this intelligence agency, will today try to justify themselves for going with the Pentagon's narrative on everything, which doesn't make any logical sense. So this is something to be aware of, that your government, if you're based in the U.S., has actually been found guilty of supporting a terrorist group inside Nicaragua, ordered to pay reparations, and yet refuses to do so. But let's go to our last story. This is an FYI for everyone. And George Soros, who is the creator of the Open Society Foundation, he's very much aged. He's 92 years old. He's finally decided to step down, and he has left his fortune and his company in the hands of his son, who is 37. So let's talk about this a little and talk a little bit more about Soros as well. Billionaire, philanthropist, and investor George Soros, who is 92, is handing control of the Open Society Foundation to his son Alex, who was named chair in December. The foundation donates money to humanitarian and democratic causes ranging from criminal justice reform to climate change initiatives, and controls the majority of assets managed by Soros' $25 billion family office. The news was first reported in the Wall Street Journal and confirmed by a spokesperson for the organization. I'm more political than the elder Soros, Alex Soros, told the newspaper. He added that he was concerned about Donald Trump's potential White House run, which is now a reality. As much as I would love to get money out of politics, as long as the other side is doing it, we will have to do it too. Alex Soros met recently with Biden administration officials, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Brazil President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to push for issues related to the family foundation. Soros plans to double down on defending voting rights and personal freedoms at home and supporting the cause of democracy abroad, he told the Financial Times. George Soros' priorities in the U.S. politics will be unchanged by Alex's appointment, the newspaper reported, citing a close person close to the family it didn't identify. A lot of things to unpack here. Let's just start with the whole idea that the Open Society promotes democracy. Democracy, open society, these are code words, and their code words essentially are, we support societies that capitulate to Western interests, capitulate to Western needs as far as going to go with our narratives, pushing our views of the world inside of your country. If you are independent minded, if you are trying to be separate from the world system, if you're not trying to be inculcated into the United States and the Western-based rules order, then you are an enemy to the concept of an open society, because they see an open society as being one that is controlled in every single area inside of the world. So open society has been notorious for regime change. It's had a countries that try to exercise independence from this international U.S.-based world order. They've been known for regime change in places like Zimbabwe and places like Cuba. Anytime you see a group call themselves a civil society organization, that's a code word for trying to disrupt this government, trying to put in our ideas and trying to enforce regime change. And so every time that you see a civil society organization, think controlled opposition. That's literally what they are. They're not about trying to transfer power into the hands of Africans, into the hands of the oppressed. They're not trying to do that. They're trying to ensure that they have the power put inside of a grand scheme. In fact, the Open Society organization, I believe, and I have to do my research on this, but the more I think about it, it reminds me of a book called The Open Conspiracy, which literally details how the New World Order will come into being, how it will operate. So that's a book you can look into if you've not seen it. But yeah, so the Open Society, again, they're about trying to bring everyone into this international order, this what we know is the New World Order. And they do so with money. They do so with so-called charity, because unfortunately for so many of our people, as much as we can act big and bold and about our business, when it comes to a check, when it comes to the dollar signs, we will be willing to sell our people out, sell ourselves out in order to go over to the other side and get enriched. And they know that is a weakness of many of our people and many people in general. So there is a change of power. That's just the takeaway. George Soros, although he will probably be passing away soon, he's 92 years old. He's leaving a son who's going to be his heir, who's going to continue the same operations. Don't focus so much on the individuals. That's probably the biggest takeaway. Focus on the mission. Focus on the ties. There's always another George Soros. There's always ones who are more secretive and more under the basically just more out of the view of public viewing. And so that's what we have to keep in mind whenever we're dealing with these individuals. So with that, I want to thank you all for watching. I also want to take time to thank everyone who donates, whether you donate on YouTube or you donate on Cash App. I know I am able to thank people on YouTube, usually in the chat, but I do want to take time to just shout out everyone who donated on Cash App as well. Thank you everyone for watching. I will see you all in the next video.
We are not Africans. All right. We are possessed by spirits and demons. We have let another people's spirit take possession of our bodies and take possession of our minds. When we speak, it is not with our African voice. It is with the voice of that demonic presence that uses our lips to speak its own language. Yes. Yes, and we have to recognize this. We are possessed. And if we are to transform ourselves and to transform the nature of our relationship with those who are our masters, we must engage in an exorcism and clear the devils out of our minds. And at this time, then, it'll pay you to read a little bit about demonic possession. And we have to be demonically possessed. Because if we talk about black-on-black violence, self-defeating behavior, self-destructive behavior, then we could not be possessed by a beautiful and wonderful God. We must be possessed by a demon. It's interesting to look at the literature on possession. We have a couple of types of possession. One is called a somnambulistic possession. Somnambulistic. Soma, in this instance, having to do with sleep. You hear it in the word sominex. Ambulistic, to move around. Ambulatory, right? So we're talking about people who are what? Sleepwalking. They're not awake, but they're walking around. The body is moving, and it is walking in an organized fashion and walking systematically, but the person is still asleep. And in somnambulistic possession, then, the individual's original self has been repressed and displaced, and he identifies with the spirit that possesses him. And his I and the spirit's I are one and the same. And we have a lot of that here today. Where the spirit that has been implanted in us, we have taken to be us, and we've identified with it. That is why in defending ourselves, we end up defending the people who rule over us. In defending our ego, we end up maintaining the social structure that has destroyed our ego to begin with. And you see it in our youngsters, who will fight and kill in the name of respect, and fight because their egotistic orientation has been insulted. And therefore, in defending their ego, they do not kill the people who destroyed their ego, they kill each other. And maintain the ones who destroyed them in the first place in power. And that's why the subtitle of my book, Black on Black Violence, was Black Self-Annihilation in Service of White Domination. We are killing each other in order to maintain this system. We have let ourselves become possessed by a spirit such that when we become aggressive, we aggress against the self instead of those who are the source of our aggressive orientation.